This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of Roots and All, where my guest is Andrew Jackson, a new build gardener and the author and lead of a new campaign to promote new build garden spaces, the new Build Manifesto. Andrew has spent more than a decade working as a director in social housing, and is now taking that experience to campaign for better quality garden spaces for homeowners. His campaign seeks to work with developers and homeowners to provide a better experience for owners and a better home for nature.
My route into gardening is similar to some people's, I suppose, but different to others in that I've come to it quite late, in that I rather prejudiciously thought that gardening was kind of for old people. When I was young, it was something that older people did, but wasn't something that kind of younger people ever really thought about. And my dad was always a big gardener, and my partner's mother has always been a big gardener as well. So I sort of sat there nodding along in conversations with them and thought, this all sounds very interesting. I've lived in a few new build houses, and the gardens have always been quite small. And it wasn't until we moved to our current house in East Yorkshire in Beverley 3 years ago, where we got a decent sized plot. And I thought, actually, there's something I can do with this. And, I'm always interested in giving things a go. So it was really from that I took lots of advice from friends and relatives and all of that sort of stuff, and started to develop a bit of a vision for what I wanted to do. But my background, outside of gardening is nothing to do with gardening. I've worked in social housing for the last 11 years. Which in a way is linked to what I'm sort of going to talk about a bit today, really, which is that need for outdoor spaces, and particularly in the social housing sphere, that need for the equality around outdoor spaces and people having access to good quality spaces as well. So I guess all linked in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe you've come up with a thing called the New Build Manifesto. I wondered if you could just explain that and how you came up with the concept.
Yeah, so again, I think as a new build homeowner, I've noticed that you can bespoke almost any element of your house. You can choose what colour doorknobs you have, you can choose what colour kitchen cabinets you have, you can choose almost anything about your new home when you're buying them off plan. But what you can't choose, and what you seemingly have no say over whatsoever, is what the outdoor space is. You get given a plot. Sometimes it comes with turf, sometimes it doesn't even come with that. It's just a kind of combination of builder's rubbish and all sorts of other gremlins that lie below the surface. So it got me to thinking really around, is there more actually that we can do to raise the profile on new build spaces? And I think when I've looked around at the sort of gardening press and the gardening media, there does feel like there's still a bit of a paucity of advice out there for that specific group of new build gardeners who, given the ambitions of governments past and present to build more new homes, they're the fastest growing gardening community in the country. And I think we'll have the opportunity to have the biggest impact of any community around gardening and around nature going forward. So to me, it made a lot of sense to start thinking about how could we do more to shine a bit of a light on new build spaces and come up with a bit of a campaign that encouraged developers perhaps to think about their role and what more they could do for new build owners without them spending lots more money, which, having worked with developers over a number of years, are not necessarily always that keen to do for understandable reasons. They've got to protect profit margins and all of that sort of stuff. But also, how can new build owners and the community of kind of new build owners think about their spaces in a slightly different way? I always think about my space as something that I've taken, in that the land here before was green land. It wasn't green belt land, but it was green land. It was farmland. It was something that nature used and had access to. So I feel quite strongly, actually, that I've got a responsibility as someone who's taken land to actually try and give something back and create a space that actually, hopefully, in terms of biodiversity, adds to what was there before rather than takes away from it. So the campaign's really about that combination of things, really, in that it's about talking to developers in terms of what else they might be able to do, but also putting some of that responsibility onto new build homeowners themselves, but also the garden media as well, in terms of shining more of a spotlight on this massive group and this massive community actually that could have a tremendous impact over the next 50 to 100 years on what our outdoor spaces look like.
It's a fantastic idea. And I know this is probably a slightly daft question, but are new build gardens, do they tend to be smaller than, say, older plots? And do you have any idea of the amount of space that you're talking about that could be kind of potentially used to benefit nature and people going forward?
Yeah, so new build gardens do tend to be smaller. In fact, almost completely, they are smaller than sort of traditional plots. Over the years, developers have tried to fit more houses into a sort of smaller overall space, purely to deliver the volume of homes, which again is a target and an ambition shared by the government themselves. The knock-on effect of that, of course, is that with those spaces getting smaller, sometimes it's difficult to imagine what you might do with a small space, and the tendency is to put a bit of patio down, leave a bit of lawn in place, and that's kind of it. New build spaces tend to be no bigger really than kind of 10 meters squared. And when I say squared, I don't always mean squared because they're often actually quite long rectangular gardens, but very narrow and surrounded almost on all sides by long lines of bare fencing. And the bare fencing actually is a real challenge actually for gardeners in covering the sheer amount of bare fence that you're faced with when you move into a new build property and understanding the sorts of things you might be able to do to hide that, to screen it, all of that sort of stuff. It can seem quite overwhelming actually.
And you mentioned soil quality and stuff. I think there are some fairly common problems that crop up with new build gardens. So, apart from the vast expanse of bare fence and the slightly iffy soil occasionally, are there any other challenges that are fairly common to new build homeowners?
Yeah, the other thing I would say that is perhaps slightly unique or certainly different perhaps to some older properties is you are, again, and it's about space, you're overlooked by so many houses. So if I'm looking out my window now, on both sides, I'm overlooked by probably 12, 13 different properties, which, some people don't necessarily have a problem with. But for me, a garden is a space that I want as my own sort of sanctuary and don't necessarily want, the neighborhood to see every move I make in the garden. I think there's that desire as gardeners and people that have gardens for that little bit of shelter and sometimes privacy that can be really challenging in new build spaces again because of how close houses are built to each other and the layout of estates. So that overlooking challenge is a really interesting one and a difficult one at times because often the answer to being overlooked is to create sort of instant privacy and instant screening, which of course with that comes cost because you pay for maturity and you pay for time essentially when you're buying plants, as we know. So that can be a challenge if you've not got the budget to immediately buy sort of mature trees and shrubs. You find your garden being overlooked by dozens of neighbours. And the other thing I'd say that is linked to not just soil quality, but I think compaction of the soil as well. In that, I've spoken to a lot of people, and myself included, where the soil quality has not just been poor, but the work that the builders have done has left such an impact, and the ground has been so compacted down that the drainage on it, in places is absolutely appalling. And people find their gardens turning into bogs overnight when they've had a little bit of rain because the soil is just so compacted.
Yeah, and it sounds as if it's a kind of two-pronged approach. Obviously, you need the developers to get on board and to hopefully do things better, but you also want to inform the garden owners so that they can take ownership of the garden going forward and how successful it is. So thinking from the sort of developer's point of view, from them, what would you hope that they would do in terms of making this better for people?
Sure. So there's a few things really I think that developers can do, but I don't think would add a huge amount of cost into their profile. So firstly, I think they could really look to build on that bespoking point I was talking about right at the start, which is, you can bespoke everything inside a house. Why can't you bespoke everything outside the house? And I genuinely think that a lot of demand for almost ready-made gardens for people. I think one of the things about new build gardens is they're often quite time poor. They're often fairly affluent, given that they're buying their own home, but actually sometimes haven't got the time to invest in a garden, certainly up front. And therefore, I think if a developer could team up with local garden designers, local landscapers, making an impact in local communities rather than necessarily going with more national organisations, working with local businesses. I genuinely think it would be such a fantastic experience for new build owners to walk into their fantastically laid out, pristine new home, to have a ready-made new build garden that's been done for them. I think there's a market there for that, and it would genuinely be something that would help local garden designers and local landscapers as well. It's just a depressing kind of feeling, actually, that you walk into this wonderful new space and then you look out of your window and it's a mud bath out there. It kind of takes away from the kind of wonderfulness of having a new home. So I think that there's that. And then I think if people want to have turf in their garden, I'm not going to start a turf war. I don't have any turf in my garden, and I spent the last 3 years trying to get rid of it. But I appreciate, of course, people like turf. They want turf. People that have got families as well need turf for all sorts of reasons. I think if you want turf in a new build garden, developers should just leave perhaps a little bit of space around the outside so that people have got those borders. I know that from past new builds when we've had turf, just digging out a border and getting rid of the turf can feel like a kind of overwhelming task, actually. Whereas if you get a developer to just leave a bit of space around the edges, so you've got that border in place and can almost put plants in there straight away, again, I think that would make a huge difference to people in terms of what their imagination might be able to do, rather than just that thought of everything being like a lot of hard work, actually, to even remove the turf from their gardens or the bits of it that they don't want. And then I think there's the practice that isn't widespread, and I don't want to generalize, but some developers do sell off topsoil on their sites, which I think from a gardener's perspective, I don't think it makes developers a huge amount of money. I don't think it would cost them a massive amount to just leave the topsoil in place. It would make a huge difference to the soil quality. So I think developers just perhaps being a little bit more mindful about, if a garden isn't turfed when an owner comes in, just leaving the soil in a reasonable state, would make a huge difference. I think wildlife corridors, again, some developers are doing this already, installing swift boxes into houses, onto roofs and hedgehog highways, all of that sort of stuff, which for a developer are not going to cost them a huge amount. It's some of this is talking about just leaving a little gap in the fence, which is not a huge amount of work and doesn't add any extra cost ultimately to what they're building. One of the things I've seen from our experience here is that we've created something that I believe is a kind of haven for wildlife, but it's a bit like an oasis in a desert to some extent, in that we are still surrounded by bare fencing, lawn in some places, but not in others. Some people who have not touched their garden for 3 years. And again, that's not a criticism of any individual. But if we are, as a community of owners, to make a difference to wildlife and to nature, everyone has to play a role in that. And therefore, developers need to try and make that as easy as possible for owners. So I think just some of those small things. And then I think with climate change and the issue around water, installing water butts as a standard procedure in all new build homes, and some developers do this already, but that should just be standard practice. All of the drainage systems and the guttering in new build homes, absolutely perfect for putting water butts in there. Again, it's not going to cost the earth for a developer to install a water butt in a property. As I say, some do it already, and that would make a huge difference, actually, in terms of just water retention and water usage, which, as we know, is an absolutely massive issue for new builds, old builds at the moment. So just some of that, what I think is quite basic stuff, and not, in my mind, revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination, but it's, I think, bringing all of this into a coherent set of thought is really the thought behind the manifesto, I suppose.
And as you say, it is basic. And I think people listening might be surprised that actually some of this stuff isn't mandated and that developers aren't obligated to do this anyway. What are their obligations when they hand over a new build and the garden?
That's part of the challenge, so it's very, very little. They're not obligated other than to provide an area of space They're not obligated to provide anything beyond that. And there's a real tension, I think, with the government's desire. And again, this is not a political point because it's governments of all colours, have made political promises about new build home programs over the last particularly 10, 20 years, that volume house building doesn't necessarily lend itself to thoughtful house building and putting things like what does the garden look and feel like at the forefront of their minds. There are still lots of developers whose main focus is building as many homes as they can in as short a space as possible. And that doesn't necessarily align with a thoughtful approach to outdoor space. So they're not mandated on a home by home basis to do very much at all. They are mandated to provide areas of kind of common green space. And our developer, where we are at the moment, actually has done a pretty good job of planting some trees out on some common space and doing some landscaping outside of properties on the sort of common areas. So they do have to provide a certain amount of green space. But again, what they do with that is kind of not mandated at all. And you'll find on a lot of new build estates, it's just a whole load of overgrown grass with perhaps a children's playground in the middle of it, which, doesn't necessarily inspire.
No, and as you say, it would be good if developers could deliver a garden that was what somebody wanted and functioned in the way that they needed it to. In the absence of that, as you say, there has to be a little bit of responsibility taken by the people who buy new build homes. And what would you like to see kind of from their side happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's about personal preference to some extent, but I think often people's first move when they look at a garden and a new build garden, it is the kind of hard landscaping element. I've seen a lot of new build gardens where what they've done over a number of years is simply just kind of extend the patio space and not really thought about the planting or, what that might mean for nature and the environment at all, and again, that's not about casting sort of aspersions or criticizing anyone's kind of personal choice about what they do with their garden. But I guess it's about new build gardeners thinking in that way, really, that you have taken land away and that actually there's a responsibility there as an owner to try and add back to the ecosystem that you're existing in. And I certainly take that responsibility really seriously. So I think it's a way of thinking about a garden in that you can create entertaining spaces, you can create all of those things that actually you want, perhaps from hard landscaping, patios, fire pits, pergolas, all of that sort of stuff that you see a lot in new build gardens, all of which completely add value and can be really enriching. But it's thinking about those alongside how you might enrich the planting side and actually how planting enhances all of those things, rather than detracting from them. So I think it's about getting new build gardeners to think about those two things hand in hand, and that it's not a kind of either or choice that, if you want to use your garden for entertaining, that means you fill it with stone and kind of patio and nothing else, that you can do both of those things. And actually by doing both of those things, the garden is a much better place for you and for nature as well.
Do you think that it might be almost a community effort? Because as you say, these gardens are fairly small, they're very linked together, but kind of en masse, they make up a fairly decent chunk of potential habitat for wildlife. But there might need to be some collaboration between homeowners. I'm just thinking, as you said, if you're trying to shade and then you stick in a tree and then that tree eventually goes over the fence, shades your neighbour's garden, etc., and you might have holes in your fences for hedgehogs, but you kind of need everybody else in the road to do the same thing. Do you think that there's the potential there for there to be kind of formal groups within development so that these things can have a bit more joined up thinking and that everyone can discuss what they want to do, maybe head off any problems at the past, that kind of thing?
I definitely think so, and I think it's not going to work unless that does happen, Sarah, in all honesty. And I think unless there is a collective effort, there will always be people who will go the extra mile and will try and take that responsibility seriously. But without the collective, you're kind of going against the grain to some extent, and you will always be those sort of oases in a wider desert. So definitely there's a role for wider communities. I think there's also a role for the garden media, in that I think I said at the top of the conversation that there's more that can be done. I look at some of the programs on the television and then some of the garden media as well, and they have the most incredible gardens. It's almost like garden porn to some extent, in that they are so beautiful and so nice, but almost completely unrealistic to the kind of average homeowner. And, a lot of stuff you read is about, well, you take the little bits that you can sort of apply to your garden. But if I think about some of the stuff that's in trend at the moment around sort of prairie planting and planting in huge swathes, which looks so effective in big gardens, not practical in a kind of small space. If you planted en masse in terms of doing sort of prairie planting, you'd only have sort of 2 varieties of plants in the whole garden, given some of the spaces that people have available to them. So I definitely think there's more on the community side, but I think there's a lot more in the garden media and the garden press that need to shine more of a light on new build spaces, but just more realistic spaces. I mean, everyone loves to see the gardens on TV that look amazing, look fantastic, that stately homes and castles and all of that sort of stuff. Incredible places and they're fantastic. But it's not real and practical advice, and that's what I think, new build gardens particularly really need, is that they are, and again, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but they're often the group with the least amount of knowledge around gardening. They're often buying their first home. It's often their first outdoor space. Gardening and sometimes the garden media can seem completely impenetrable actually to people that are sort of new onto their theme. So we need to try and make some of that stuff as accessible for people as possible, without having almost this 2-tier system of those that have had gardens for years and those that are new to gardening. There's no right way or wrong way, or no good space or bad space. It's all kind of equal, but it doesn't feel like it plays out sometimes like that. It's certainly in the garden media.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And in terms of getting the idea out there, I believe that you have a show garden at Harrogate. So is that going to be along this theme?
Yes, it is. So I'm doing one of the creative borders at Harrogate Spring Show, which is a fantastic opportunity. So I'm creating a border which is called Over the Fence, which is kind of a deliberately quite provocative theme, I suppose, which the idea really is to have a fence running halfway along the border. And on the one half, a completely desolate builder's rubbish, sand, the stuff that you're left with when you start. And then on the other side, hopefully what will be a bit of a showcase in terms of actually what you can do in a very short space of time to turn an empty new build plot into something that is enticing to nature, but also is something that's really fantastic to live in as families and as people. So yeah, I'm really, really excited about the opportunity to do that. And I think the Harrogate show were really excited about the concept, and I think it's not something they've necessarily seen or done before. So yeah, I'm really hopeful and optimistic actually with the fantastic crowds that they get at the show. It'll have a real impact for people.
Thank you very much to Andrew for sharing details of this exciting new campaign, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 305, Building on Nature, and episode 251, Green Roofs and City Wildlife. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.